The silent healing. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the Hawthorne estate bathed in a dull gray light. The windows glistened with the residue of the storm, and the gardens outside sagged under the weight of water-soaked leaves. Inside, however, the stillness was oppressive. Edward sat in his study, his scotch glass untouched on the desk beside him. The note Maya had left rested open where he had placed it the night before, its simple words haunting him. He had read it so many times that he could see the strokes of the pen imprinted in his mind, each letter carved into him as deeply as regret. He had dismissed 14 women with hardly a thought, his pride intact, his control unshaken. But Maya Williams was different. She had not begged, had not cowered, had not stormed away with complaints about his children. Instead, she had left with dignity, leaving behind silence, not the empty silence that usually weighed down the mansion, but a peace he could not explain. For the first time in months, his sons had slept without screaming, and it had not been his doing. That realization both humbled and unsettled him. Edward's pride would not allow him to admit it aloud, not even to Mrs. Keller, who hovered nearby, moving about the study with an anxious air. She had seen the strike, seen the red mark on Maya's face, and though she said nothing, her eyes condemned him more than words could. He could not bear her quiet judgment, so he busied himself with paperwork he did not care about, numbers and contracts blurring into meaningless lines. Yet no matter how hard he tried to focus, the memory returned. The twins curled against Maya as though she had been their mother, their breathing steady, their faces calm. He had ruined it with one moment of uncontrolled anger, and now she was gone. Maya, meanwhile, walked back to her small apartment on the other side of town, her cheek still sore, though the sting was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. She had not expected gratitude, but she had not expected violence either. Still, she did not cry. Maya had known worse pains, had borne deeper scars, and she had long ago taught herself that tears were wasted on those who did not care to see them. She thought instead of Ethan's trembling hands, Eli's soft whimper when he clung to her shirt, the way they had relaxed against her body as though she had taken away the monsters in their dreams. She could still feel their warmth on her arms, and that thought steadied her. She had done what she came to do. She had given them a moment of safety, even if fleeting. That was enough for now. Her apartment was modest, a far cry from the marble and chandeliers of the Hawthorne estate. The furniture was second-hand, the walls painted in soft creams she had chosen to make the place warmer. A bookshelf lined with worn novels and old journals stood by the window, and a single plant, her mother's favorite lily, sat in the corner, thriving under her careful attention. Maya lowered herself onto the couch, her body weary from the night, but her mind would not rest. She thought of her own childhood, of the way her mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, of the nights when Maya had cried herself to sleep after bullies at school mocked her for being poor, for being different, for being too dark in a world that often praised the opposite. Her mother had always said, "Strength is not in what the world gives you, baby, but in how you face what it takes away." Those words had carried her through heartbreak, through loss, through nights when the world felt unbearably heavy. They carried her still. What Edward Hawthorne did not know, what he could not see in his arrogance, was that Maya's calm was not born from ease but from hardship. She had known chaos. She had lived in it. That was why she could stand so still when Ethan screamed, why she could hold Eli when he trembled. Pain recognized pain, and in her the boys had sensed someone who would not flinch, who would not abandon them when they were too much to bear. It was not magic, not mystery. It was love of the kind that had been forged in fire. Back at the mansion, the twins awoke to find Maya gone. At first, they thought perhaps she had gone downstairs for breakfast, but when Mrs. Keller gently told them she would not be coming back, their faces crumpled. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and Eli hid his face in his pillow, muffling his sobs. Edward, who had been standing silently in the doorway, felt a sharp pang in his chest at the sight. He had always believed discipline would make his boys stronger, that showing weakness would only harm them, but watching them cry for a woman who had been with them for less than a week made him question everything he thought he knew. They had not cried for the nannies who left before. They had not clung to them or begged for them to stay, but Maya, they wanted her. They needed her, and he had driven her away. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Ethan and Eli grew quieter, retreating into themselves. They no longer screamed through the night, but neither did they smile. They sat at the table with dull expressions, ate little and spoke even less. Mrs. Keller scolded Edward in her gentle but firm way, reminding him that children could not be forced into healing. "You struck down the only person who reached them," she said one evening, her eyes sharp with disapproval. "You may have money, sir, but money will not hold your children when they're frightened. It will not sing to them when nightmares steal their sleep. She did what none of us could, and you threw it away." Her words burned, but Edward could not deny the truth. He found himself pacing at night, staring at the note again and again, wondering if there was a way to make things right. He was not a man who apologized easily. He built empires, crushed competitors, commanded respect. Yet none of those skills mattered when it came to two little boys who recoiled at his touch, or a woman who had left because he could not control his rage. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, Edward found himself standing by the twins' doorway. He watched them sleep, curled up together like mirror images. Ethan twitched in his dreams, and Edward's hand twitched too, as though he wanted to reach out but did not know how. He whispered into the darkness, his voice breaking in a way no one else would ever hear. "I'm sorry, Amelia. I don't know what I'm doing." He did not know that Mrs. Keller had quietly written down Maya's address, that she kept it hidden in her apron pocket, waiting for the day when Edward's pride would finally collapse beneath the weight of his regret. Because deep down she knew the truth. The Hawthorne family would never heal without Maya Williams. And no matter how hard Edward fought against it, fate had a way of circling back. The storm and the stranger, the rain had a way of making the Hawthorne estate look even colder than usual. It was a grand mansion perched on the outskirts of town, its iron gates towering like sentinels, its gardens trimmed with mathematical precision. But no matter how perfectly polished the marble floors or how meticulously placed the chandeliers, the house carried a chill that no fire could banish. The neighbors whispered about it. A house that once brimmed with laughter now echoed only with silence, broken at night by the cries of two small boys. Inside, Edward Hawthorne paced the study like a lion trapped in too small a cage. His tall, broad frame radiated authority. Dark hair fell in waves against his forehead, though streaks of gray had begun to creep in far earlier than they should have. His eyes, sharp, stormy, and always searching, were the kind of eyes that made most men lower their heads. But behind their steel lay exhaustion. The twins, Ethan and Eli, had worn through every nanny he had hired. 14 women had come and gone in less than a year. 14 smiling faces who entered with hopeful promises, only to leave pale and trembling, claiming the boys were unmanageable, disturbed, impossible. Edward paid generously, but no amount of money had bought his son's peace. It wasn't their fault. Not really. Grief had carved its way through the family like a cruel sculptor. 2 years earlier, Edward's wife, gentle, radiant Amelia, had died suddenly in a car accident. One moment she was kissing the boys goodnight, the next she was gone. Ethan and Eli were only 6, too young to understand why the world they knew had shattered. Their grief didn't show up in words, but in nightmares, fits, nosebleeds, and fear. Edward himself was no better. He buried his pain beneath endless work and harsh discipline, convinced that control could replace comfort. But every slammed door, every barked order only widened the chasm between father and sons. The twins recoiled from him as though his love were a knife they couldn't touch without bleeding. And so, night after night, the mansion filled with screams. Mrs. Keller, the aging housekeeper who had served the Hawthorne family for decades, did her best, but her health was fragile and her patience worn. She often begged Edward to stop hiring strangers who came with credentials but no heart. "Children don't need a resume, sir," she told him once. "They need someone who'll stay no matter what." Edward ignored her, or pretended to. That evening, the storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside. Ethan had woken screaming again, his small body trembling as blood trickled from his nose. Eli, frightened by his brother's panic, had joined in, his cries high-pitched and desperate. The nanny of the week, a nervous young woman named Carla, tried to soothe them. But her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the tissues steady. Edward stormed into the room, his presence like a thunderclap. "Enough," he barked. "Stop this nonsense at once." The boys flinched, their sobs turning into hiccups of fear. Carla's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Hawthorne, I don't think I can handle this." "Then leave," Edward snapped, his patience snapping like brittle glass. "Get out!" Carla didn't hesitate. She dropped the tissues, muttered a shaky apology, and fled down the stairs, never to return. Edward stood by the bed, chest heaving, watching his son's tear-streaked faces. For a moment, regret flickered in his expression. Then it hardened. "Go to sleep," he said stiffly, his voice flat with command rather than comfort. But the twins only cried harder. Mrs. Keller appeared at the door, wringing her hands. "Sir, they need gentleness, not orders." Edward shot her a look sharp enough to cut. "What they need is discipline. And peace." But peace was the one thing this house never seemed to hold. The next morning, Mrs. Keller did something bold. She placed a call without Edward's permission. At precisely noon, a woman arrived at the gate. Her umbrella was small and cheap, doing little to shield her from the relentless drizzle. Her coat was worn but neatly pressed, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her name was Maya Williams. She was not what Edward expected. For one, she wasn't young or fragile like the others. She was in her late 20s with warm brown skin, natural curls tucked beneath a scarf, and eyes that held both gentleness and steel. When the butler led her into the study, Edward barely glanced up from his paperwork. "You're here about the position," he said curtly. "I should warn you, it won't last." Maya smiled faintly. "Maybe it will. Children need patience, not warnings." Edward looked up then, surprised by the quiet confidence in her voice. Most applicants fidgeted, eager to please. Maya stood calm, hands folded, as though she had nothing to prove. "You've heard the rumors," he said. 14 nannies have already failed." "I've heard," she replied. "But I'm not them." He studied her, searching for cracks in her composure. "And what makes you think you're different?" Maya hesitated, then said simply, "Because I've been broken too, and broken people know how to sit with others in their pain." For a fleeting second, something in Edward's chest tightened. He pushed it away. "Mrs. Keller, this is your idea, isn't it?" he muttered. The housekeeper lifted her chin. "Yes, sir. And you'd do well to give her a chance." Edward didn't believe in chances, but he was too tired to argue. "Fine," he said. 1 week. No more." Maya only nodded. 1 week is all it takes to show I mean what I say." From the start, Maya did things differently. Instead of scolding the boys for their tantrums, she listened. When Ethan screamed at her to leave, she sat quietly on the floor until he tired himself out, never once raising her voice. When Eli cried in the night, she didn't rush him back to bed. She hummed softly, a tune her mother used to sing, until his breathing steadied. She didn't try to erase their grief. She honored it. By the third night, something remarkable happened. Ethan and Eli fell asleep in Maya's arms. Their small bodies curled against her as though she were the safe harbor they had been searching for all along. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. Truly quiet. That was when Edward found them. He had come upstairs late, his coat still damp from a business meeting, his head pounding with stress. He pushed open the bedroom door and froze. There she was, Maya Williams, the stranger he had doubted, sitting on his bed with his sons nestled against her. The sight ignited a storm of emotions: rage, disbelief, confusion. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed?" His voice cracked like thunder. Maya startled but didn't move, her hands resting gently on the boys' backs. "I can explain," she said softly. "They begged me not to leave. They were afraid. This was the only way they calmed down." Edward's jaw clenched. To his eyes, it looked like intrusion, like trespass, like weakness. His pride roared louder than reason. Before Maya could finish her sentence, he lashed out. His palm struck her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed in the stillness. The boys stirred, Eli whimpering, Ethan's nose beginning to bleed again. Maya's hand flew to her cheek, but she didn't cry out. Her wide eyes met his, not with fear but with stunned disappointment. "You're fired," Edward growled, his voice rough. "Get out of my house now." For a long, breathless moment, Maya didn't move. Then she looked down at the boys, her expression softening. She bent, kissed their foreheads, and whispered nothing at all, just left the promise of her presence in that gentle touch. Then she rose, shoes in hand, and walked past Edward without a word. Downstairs, Mrs. Keller gasped when she saw the red mark blooming on Maya's cheek. "Oh, child," she whispered. But Maya only shook her head and stepped into the rain, pulling her coat tighter as she disappeared through the gate. Edward returned to the bedroom, chest heaving with fury that quickly collapsed into something else, something rawer. The twins were asleep, Not tossing, not screaming, not sweating through their sheets, just asleep. His throat tightened as he sat on the edge of the bed. 14 nannies, dozens of doctors, endless nights of screaming. And yet this woman, this soft-spoken stranger, had managed what none of them could. On the nightstand lay a note, folded once. He opened it. If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Edward stared at the words until they blurred. In the mirror across the room, his own reflection glared back at him. A man hardened by grief, drowning in control, choking on silence. For the first time in months, the Hawthorne house was silent. Not with grief or rage, with peace. A peace Maya had left behind. But she was gone, and Edward didn't know how to bring her back. The fire within. The Hawthorne estate had always been a monument to wealth, power, and control. Its polished marble floors, towering ceilings, and rows of glittering chandeliers spoke of a man who believed the world could be bent to his will. Yet as the weeks passed after Maya's return, the mansion began to reflect something Edward had not expected. The echoes of grief that once filled the halls were gradually replaced with the sound of laughter, the high, unrestrained giggles of two little boys rediscovering joy. It startled him at first. He had grown accustomed to silence or cries, to fear and anger ricocheting from one room to another. But now, on some afternoons as he walked through the house, he would hear Ethan and Eli chasing each other down the corridor, while Maya's gentle voice urged them not to knock over vases or scratch the polished wood. For a man like Edward, who had fought battles in boardrooms and clawed his way through ruthless industries, it was almost disarming to realize the greatest victory unfolding under his own roof was not his doing at all. It was hers. Maya's presence changed the rhythm of the household in ways Edward could not ignore. She was not loud, not forceful, not overbearing. Rather, she carried an aura of quiet strength that seemed to command respect without demanding it. The staff, who had once gone about their duties with an air of caution and fear under Edward's sharp gaze, now worked with a newfound ease, often pausing to smile at the sound of the children's play. Even Mrs. Keller seemed lighter, her tired shoulders lifted as though a weight had been removed. Edward found himself observing these shifts in silence, both fascinated and unsettled by how one woman could alter the very atmosphere of a place he had believed unchangeable. The twins themselves blossomed under Maya's care. Ethan, who had once been prone to violent nosebleeds and restless tantrums, began to channel his energy into drawings. Maya had given him a box of crayons and a stack of paper, and before long his little hands were covered in streaks of color, his mind focused on sketching out superheroes and fantastical animals. Eli, the quieter of the two, discovered a love for stories. Every evening Maya would gather them in the nursery, her voice weaving through fairy tales and fables, bringing the characters to life until Eli's eyes glowed with wonder. For the first time since Amelia's death, both boys began to look less like fragile remnants of a broken family, and more like children who believed the world could still hold magic. Yet, with this healing came new conflicts, particularly between Edward and Maya. Though he could not deny her impact on the children, his instinct for control clashed with her methods. One afternoon, Edward entered the playroom to find Ethan balancing precariously on a chair as he attempted to reach a toy placed high on a shelf. His immediate reaction was sharp, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Ethan, get down at once. You'll break your neck." The boy froze, eyes wide with fear, the toy slipping from his grasp. Maya stepped forward quickly, lifting Ethan down with steady hands, her tone gentle but firm as she addressed Edward. "He doesn't need to be shouted at for trying to be brave. He needs guidance, not fear." Edward bristled, unused to being challenged in his own home. Guidance doesn't mean indulging recklessness. Rules are there for a reason. They keep people safe. Maya's eyes met his, unwavering. Rules without compassion breed resentment. "What he heard in your tone wasn't safety, Mr. Hawthorne, it was rejection. And that wound will cut deeper than any fall from a chair." Her words struck him harder than he expected. For a moment he wanted to argue, to assert his authority, to remind her that he was the father and she was only an employee. But when he glanced at Ethan, who clung to Maya's hand with wide, uncertain eyes, his anger faltered. He saw his son's fear, saw the way it mirrored the fear he himself had carried as a boy under his own father's cold discipline. That memory silenced him more effectively than any rebuke ever could. These confrontations became more frequent, yet strangely, Edward found himself drawn to them. Maya's defiance was not fueled by arrogance or disrespect. It was born of conviction, of a fierce determination to protect the children's fragile healing. He began to realize that where others had bent under his authority, Maya stood firm not because she sought power, but because she sought what was best for the twins. In some unspoken way, her strength demanded his respect even when it irritated him. And beneath his frustration, there was something else simmering, something he could not quite name but felt keenly whenever her steady eyes met his. As for Maya, she remained cautious around Edward. She did not forget the sting of his hand on her cheek, nor the arrogance in his voice the night he had cast her out. But as she watched him slowly attempt to bridge the distance between himself and his children, she glimpsed cracks in his armor. There were nights when he lingered by the nursery door, listening to her stories without stepping inside. There were mornings when she caught him watching the twins play, a shadow of longing on his face. And once, when Eli crawled into Edward's lap unexpectedly, the man froze at first, then awkwardly wrapped his arms around the boy, his expression caught between discomfort and something that looked dangerously close to tenderness. Maya saw it all, and though she told herself to remain guarded, she could not deny that beneath his flaws lay a man drowning in his own grief, desperate for a way out. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, Maya sat in the library with the twins curled against her, their heads heavy with sleep. Edward entered quietly, his footsteps muffled on the rug. For a long moment he stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. The children safe, the woman who was not their mother yet had given them peace, and himself, a man who had nearly destroyed it all. Something unspoken passed between them then, a fragile truce wrapped in silence. Their eyes met, and for the first time Edward did not see an intruder in his house but someone who belonged there, someone who had succeeded where he had failed. The firelight danced across Maya's face, highlighting the strength in her features, the quiet determination in her gaze. Edward felt a stirring deep within him, something dangerous, something he had locked away since Amelia's death. It frightened him, but it also ignited a spark of hope he had thought long extinguished. And in that moment, though neither spoke a word, the walls between them began to crack, not completely, not enough to collapse, but enough for the fire within to flicker to life. The impossible done winter descended upon the Hawthorne estate with a quiet, relentless beauty. Snow blanketed the gardens, softening the sharp lines of the hedges and making the sprawling mansion appear almost delicate under its glittering white crown. The cold air outside was biting, yet within the house something had shifted toward warmth. Fires burned brighter in the hearths, not just because of the weather, but because the mansion itself seemed to have remembered what it was like to breathe again. For the first time in years, laughter echoed down its marble halls. Not the brittle laughter of polite company or the hollow sound of forced amusement, but the genuine, unrestrained joy of children. Ethan and Eli had begun to laugh again, and the sound carried through the house like bells in winter air. The change was not sudden, nor was it without struggle. It was gradual, built piece by piece through Maya's tireless patience, and Edward's reluctant willingness to unlearn habits that had once defined him. Ethan no longer screamed himself, awake in the night. When nightmares crept in, he would find comfort in Maya's soft humming or, increasingly, in his father's tentative embrace. Eli, who once hid behind his brother's shadow, had begun to step forward with a growing confidence, asking questions, initiating play, even daring to pull Edward by the hand toward the garden to build snowmen. Every small step forward felt monumental, and Edward knew it was Maya who had built this bridge brick by fragile brick. For Edward, the transformation was both humbling and terrifying. He had spent years wielding authority as his shield, ruling his empire with precision and force. But in his own home, those tools had failed him. It was Maya who taught him. Without lectures or grand gestures, that authority meant little without compassion. He had once believed that to show softness was to show weakness, but as he watched his sons begin to heal, he realized that gentleness required more strength than any deal he had ever negotiated. The realization struck him with both awe and shame. Shame, for the years he had wasted pushing his children further from him. Awe for the possibility that it was not too late to repair what had been broken. Their relationship, his and Maya's, was more complicated. There were moments of quiet companionship when words were unnecessary. Evenings spent near the fire with the boys asleep, the crackle of the flames filling the silence while their gazes lingered just a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. There were also moments of friction, sharp as ice, when Edward's old habits resurfaced. Once, when Ethan tracked mud through the hall after playing outside, Edward's reprimand came too quickly, too harsh. Maya stepped between them, her eyes blazing with fire that Edward had come to both dread and admire. "He is a child, not a soldier," she said, her voice steady but unyielding. And Edward, instead of lashing out, swallowed his pride and knelt before Ethan to apologize, a gesture that startled the boy into silence but, slowly, drew a small, hesitant smile to his lips. Edward began to see himself through Maya's eyes, and it unsettled him. She saw not just the businessman, the millionaire who commanded boardrooms and estates, but the flawed man who had hidden behind his grief. At first he resisted it, clinging to his armor. But each time Maya challenged him, each time she stood firm, he found the cracks widening. It was as though she carried a lantern into the dark chambers of his soul, illuminating corners he had long since abandoned. And what surprised him most was not that she saw his brokenness, but that she did not turn away. She acknowledged it, and yet she stayed. One night, as snowflakes drifted against the tall windows, Edward found himself in the nursery after the boys had fallen asleep. Maya was there, tucking the blankets around Ethan and Eli, her touch tender, her face serene in the soft glow of the lamp. When she turned, she startled to find him watching her. For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sound the faint breathing of the children. Then Edward spoke, his voice lower, stripped of its usual steel. "You've done what I thought was impossible." Maya tilted her head, her expression calm but questioning. "And what is that, Mr. Hawthorne?" "You've given them back their childhood." He paused, swallowing hard. "And you've given me back a chance to be their father." There was a vulnerability in his words that startled even him, a raw honesty he rarely allowed himself. Maya's gaze softened, though she did not step closer. "I didn't do it alone. You chose to try, even when it was hard. That's what they will remember, that their father fought for them, not against them." Her words landed deep within him, more powerful than any praise he had ever received in the business world. For a fleeting moment he wanted to close the distance between them, to let the gratitude and something more unspoken spill into action. But the memory of Amelia, his late wife, loomed like a shadow, and he stepped back instead, afraid of betraying her memory, afraid of the fire growing in his chest whenever Maya was near. Still, the impossible had been done. The house that once echoed with grief now carried the sound of healing. Edward's relationship with his sons was far from perfect, but it was real. He found himself learning to listen, to kneel instead of tower, to comfort instead of command. And though it humbled him, it also liberated him. He realized that the legacy he wanted to leave behind was not in the size of his estate or the reach of his empire, but in the laughter of his children and the knowledge that they had been loved. But the shadow of the past lingered still, and with it the unspoken question, could Edward truly move forward? Could he allow himself not only to be a father again, but to be a man who dared to love? Because though Maya had done the impossible, with his children, Edward knew the greatest challenge yet remained within his own heart. Shadows of the past autumn deepened over the Hawthorne estate, the sprawling garden surrendering to a sea of gold and russet leaves. The air grew crisp, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from the fireplaces that now burned day and night. For the twins, this season brought a new chapter of discovery. They built forts out of blankets in the nursery, collected acorns on the lawn, and begged Maya to read their favorite stories again and again until the words imprinted themselves into memory. Edward, though still a man of restraint, began to notice that the shadows clinging to his children's eyes were receding little by little. He saw Eli's laughter return in bursts of joy, and Ethan's curiosity spark in questions about everything from the stars in the sky to the engines in his father's cars. The progress was undeniable, and though Edward remained wary of hope, he could not deny that Maya was the axis around which this transformation spun. Yet, beneath the progress, Deeper currents stirred. Edward found himself watching Maya more often, not only as a caretaker of his sons, but as a woman whose presence unsettled the strict order of his world. He noticed the way her voice carried a softness that even stern rebukes could not harden, the way her hands moved with a mixture of strength and tenderness. He noticed how the boy sought her out instinctively, how her patience seemed limitless, as though she understood something about suffering that he did not. This both fascinated and troubled him, for he was a man who prided himself on control, and here was a woman whose quiet resilience revealed how little control he truly possessed. It was Mrs. Keller who first sensed the shift. One evening she lingered near the library door as Edward stood watching Maya with the twins, and when she caught the unspoken expression on his face, she said quietly, "She carries her own ghosts, sir. Don't mistake her strength for ease. Sometimes the strongest among us are those who have already walked through fire." Edward turned sharply, unsettled by the suggestion, but her words stayed with him. He began to wonder what past had shaped Maya, what pain had forged her into someone who could endure his temper and yet still offer his children peace. The answer came unexpectedly. It was late one night when Edward, restless and unable to sleep, wandered into the kitchen. He found Maya there alone, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, her shoulders slightly hunched as though the weight of the day had finally caught up with her. She started when she saw him, then straightened, offering a polite nod. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice low. "No," he admitted, leaning against the doorway. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, to his surprise, she spoke again. "When I was 13, Maya began slowly, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her mug. "My father walked out and never came back. My mother worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat. Some nights we didn't know if the lights would stay on, or if dinner would be nothing more than bread and water. But she never gave up on us. She taught me that no matter how much the world takes, you keep loving, you keep standing. Even when you're tired, even when you're broken." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "When she passed away a few years ago, I thought I'd lose myself. But I remembered her words. Strength isn't about never falling apart. It's about refusing to let the fall be the end." Edward listened, his throat tightening at the raw honesty in her tone. He had expected resistance from her, maybe even disdain, but not this quiet unveiling of scars. Her confession stirred something deep within him, for it mirrored his own grief, his own sense of abandonment when Amelia had been taken from him. For the first time, he realized that Maya did not stand strong because her life had been free of pain. She stood strong because she had faced it and endured. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Edward found himself stepping closer, his voice rough. "You understand them because you've lived it. That's why they trust you." Maya met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I understand them because I choose to. Pain doesn't have to define us, Mr. Hawthorne, but it can teach us how to hold others when they can't hold themselves." Her words lingered long after she left the kitchen, and Edward remained there, staring into the shadows, realizing how much he had hidden behind anger and control. He had believed grief was something to conquer, a weakness to bury. But Maya showed him that grief could also be a bond, a way of connecting if only he dared to let it. Yet as the walls between them began to thin, new tensions emerged. The boys, sensing the fragile harmony forming, clung even tighter to Maya. They began to ask her to stay at bedtime rather than their father, to call for her in moments of distress rather than him. Edward could not ignore the sting this brought. Though he admired Maya, part of him resented that his sons found in her what they could not find in him. It forced him to confront questions he had long avoided. Had his anger already severed the bond beyond repair, or was there still a chance to rebuild? One evening the tension came to a head. Ethan had spilled juice on the dining room rug, and Edward, weary from a day of business setbacks, erupted with sharp words that sent the boy into tears. Maya stepped in immediately, kneeling beside Ethan, soothing him with her calm presence. Edward watched, his frustration boiling over, and snapped, "You're undermining me in my own house." Maya rose slowly, her eyes flashing with restrained fire. "No, Mr. Hawthorne. I am protecting your children from a father who confuses discipline with cruelty. If you want to command an empire, do so in your office. But here in this house, those boys need a father, not a tyrant." The words hit him like a blow, stripping away the defenses he had clung to for so long. For a moment, Edward wanted to lash back, to assert his dominance, but when he saw Ethan trembling in Maya's arms, he felt his anger collapse into something else. Shame, raw and unrelenting. He turned away, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to be that father," he admitted, the confession torn from him like a wound. Maya's voice softened then, though it remained firm. "Then learn. For them you must." That night, Edward sat alone in his study, her words echoing through him. He realized that Maya was not just teaching his sons how to heal, she was teaching him too. And though the journey terrified him for the first time, he felt the faintest glimmer of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, he could become the man his children needed. But shadows are not easily banished. And even as the household began to shift toward healing, Edward knew that the ghosts of the past, his grief, his guilt, his pride, still lingered. The question was whether he would let them destroy what was slowly being built, or find the courage to face them, with Maya's fire guiding him through the dark. Breaking walls, the days stretched long and heavy after Maya's departure. The once orderly rhythm of the Hawthorne mansion had dissolved into something hollow, something incomplete. Though the twins no longer shrieked through the night, their silence was a wound of its own. Ethan carried his teddy bear from room to room, clutching it so tightly his knuckles whitened, while Eli refused to leave his brother's side, shadowing his every movement with wide, uncertain eyes. Their meals went untouched, their laughter absent, their small voices swallowed by the vastness of the house. It was as if Maya had carried light into the darkness for a fleeting moment, and when she left, the shadows returned twice as thick. Edward noticed every detail, though he did not speak of it. He was a man used to commanding the world to obey him, yet here, within the walls of his own home, he was powerless. It infuriated him. Each time he saw Ethan's listless expression or Eli's trembling hands, a part of him burned with guilt he could not admit aloud. At night, when the house was quiet, he would sit in his study with the fire casting shadows across his face. The note Maya had left lying near his hand. The words gnawed at him. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." He had pushed her away, and now his sons were paying the price. The realization haunted him. Mrs. Keller, ever watchful, finally lost patience. One evening, as Edward stood at the window staring at the rain-slicked gardens, she approached him with a folded slip of paper in her hand. Her voice was steady, though her eyes shone with a rare fierceness. "This is her address, sir. Maya Williams. I didn't tell you before because I knew your pride would keep you from doing what's right. But your boys don't need your pride. They need her." She pressed the paper against his palm, her gnarled fingers holding his with unexpected strength. "Go to her. Beg if you must. Because if you don't, you'll lose more than nannies. You'll lose them." Edward's jaw tightened, his first instinct to bristle at her audacity. No one told Edward Hawthorne what to do. Not business partners, not employees, not even rivals. But this was not the boardroom, and Mrs. Keller was not a subordinate. She had raised him as much as she had served his parents, and her words cut through the armor he wore. For a long moment he said nothing, the silence taut between them. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he closed his hand around the paper. "I'll think about it," he muttered, though the weight in his voice betrayed him. The following afternoon, Edward found himself standing in front of a modest brick apartment building on the poorer side of town. A world away from the sprawling luxury of his estate, the air smelled faintly of fresh laundry and fried food drifting from nearby kitchens. Children's bicycles leaned against the stairwell, and a stray cat dozed on the steps. He felt out of place, his tailored suit and polished shoes drawing stares from the neighbors. For the first time in years, Edward Hawthorne felt small. He hesitated at the door with Maya's name on it, his pride warring with the gnawing ache in his chest. Finally, before he could turn away, the door opened. Maya stood there, her hair wrapped in a colorful scarf, a simple apron tied over her dress. Her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of him, but she did not step aside. She leaned against the frame, one brow raised, her posture calm but guarded. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said evenly, though there was no warmth in her tone. "To what do I owe the honor?" Edward cleared his throat, the words heavy on his tongue. He was not a man accustomed to apologies, but something about her unwavering gaze forced honesty from him. "I came to say I was wrong." He paused, the admission almost choking him. "I should not have done what I did." His voice lowered, roughened by something that sounded almost like shame. "My sons, and they haven't been the same since you left. For a moment, Maya said nothing. She studied him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Then she shook her head, her expression softening but firm. Mr. Hawthorne, this isn't about you or me. It's about those boys. They are hurting, and they need more than rules and orders. They need love, patience, and someone who won't leave when it gets hard. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. Can you give them that? Because if not, even if I come back, nothing will change. Her words stung because they were true. Edward wanted to protest, to insist he could give his sons everything they needed. But deep down, he knew he had failed them. He lowered his gaze, his shoulders heavy. I don't know if I can, but I want to try. And I know they want you there. The last words were almost a whisper, pulled from a place of vulnerability he rarely revealed. Maya studied him for a long moment, and something in his tone must have reached her. Finally, she sighed and untied her apron, hanging it on a hook by the door. One more chance, she said quietly. But this time it's not for you. It's for Ethan and Eli. And if you ever lay a hand on me again, Mr. Hawthorne, I won't just leave. I'll make sure you regret it. Edward blinked, startled by her boldness, then to his own surprise almost smiled. There was fire in her. Fire he could not extinguish with money or power. He nodded once, gravely. Understood. When Maya returned to the mansion, the boy's reaction was immediate and unrestrained. Ethan ran to her, clutching her waist with trembling hands, while Eli buried his face in her skirt, tears streaming down his cheeks. They clung to her as if afraid she might disappear again, and Maya held them both, whispering soothing words that wrapped around them like a blanket. Edward watched from the doorway, something tightening in his chest as he realized he could never inspire such devotion. His children looked at him with fear, but they looked at her with love. The contrast was both painful and humbling. From that day forward, Maya resumed her place in their lives. But this time she set boundaries, not just with the children, but with Edward as well. She did not flinch before his temper, nor did she allow him to dismiss her methods. When he barked orders, she countered with calm reasoning. When he scolded the boys for mistakes, she gently but firmly intervened, reminding him that discipline without understanding only bred fear. Slowly, she began to shift the rhythm of the house. The twins started to smile again, faintly at first, then with growing confidence. Laughter returned in small bursts, shy giggles during story time, playful squeals in the garden. The mansion, once a place of grief and tension, began to feel alive again. And Edward, though he fought it, began to change as well. He found himself lingering at doorways, watching Maya read to the boys, her voice soft and melodic, her presence grounding them. He noticed how Ethan's brow smoothed when she stroked his hair, how Eli's restless nights grew fewer under her care. And more than once he caught himself wondering not just about her gift with the children, but about the woman herself, her past, her strength, the quiet wisdom in her eyes. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. But in truth, something deeper had begun to stir.